is so totally different than the first 16 chapters that they're sure that it was not by the same author. Now, we don't know what happened. There's speculation. Mark died. Somebody finished it. The manuscript got ripped and somebody added to it. I mean, we don't know. But what was interesting is that it didn't matter a whole lot to the early church because Mark's manuscript was not the one they used very often. They preferred the Matthew and Luke version. So nobody really cared much about the Mark version. And you can see kind of why, okay? Mark had the basics, but Matthew and Luke have so much more. So it was the other two gospels that the early church tended to speak from. So, some characteristics. This gospel, the Gospel of Mark, is probably the most realistic in that it tells the stories of Jesus and what Jesus did in very factual human terms. Very, very human terms. It's not dramatized too much. It's more like a report than a tender biography. Now, it does begin with a declaration of faith, and he does use some words like describing them as the people when they heard they were astonished or amazed. But can't you hear Peter saying that? And when Jesus turned those 5 loaves and whatever fishes, fed the 5,000, the people were just astonished. You can just hear Peter saying something like that. Now, Mark gives that human quality to it. For example, he says that Jesus was a carpenter. A carpenter. Well, we've heard that. But Matthew says he was a carpenter's son. You don't want to just make Jesus be a lowly carpenter. Do you see kind of the nuance there? Mark says that the Spirit drove Jesus into the wilderness. Matthew and Luke said the Spirit led him into the wilderness.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So Marcus just has that very factual human behavior, human attitude, human emotions, where Matthew and Luke elaborate in ways that make him more deified, actually. Now, Mark describes Jesus' human emotions, and I think I listed those there for you, didn't I? So you can kind of see some of the things that Mark says. He sighed deeply, moved with compassion, marveled. How could Jesus marvel at something? He was moved with righteous anger. He loved the rich young ruler. He had pangs of hunger. That's very human. He was tired and he wanted to rest. Okay, now these are the kinds of things you're not going to read as much in Matthew and in Luke. Just a couple more things about Mark. And I really have more to say about Mark than any of them, so, well, this is our longest description. So, Mark does add some vivid details that I imagine probably Peter said. So it says that the other Gospels talk about Jesus taking a little child, but Mark says taking that child in his arms and blessed them, and he laid his hands on them. I again can hear Peter being there and saying, when Jesus called the little children to him, he took them in his arms and he blessed them. Only Mark is the one that tells the story about the 5,000. It's not in any of the other Gospels. And Mark is the one that when they were in the stormy boat, the ship in the stormy sea, Mark says that Jesus went to bed and put his head on a pillow.
Mark says that?
Mark does. Now, one of the things about Mark and his original manuscript, just finally, is that it's not very well written. It's poor grammatically, run-on sentences, just a lot of that. Now, but I am going to give you one thing to look up in Mark, okay? So I want you to look up, it was not Mark 5, so Mark 7:34. You got to find it in your book, Christy.
Oh.
7:34.
Sharon, I want you to find Mark 7:11. Sandy, I want you to find Mark 14:36. Carol speaking. Okay. All right.
Mark, what was mine again?
Mark 14:36, and Heather, Mark 15:34. Now this is going to be.
Now, what was mine again? I'm sorry.
It was 7:11.
Okay,
I didn't give you one this time. All right. Now this is your chore. Can you find something in here? How do you find it? Well, you got to start looking for Mark. Then look for what chapter numbers it says. And then you got to scroll around to where you can find the verse.
But I found it.
You found it. Good. Okay, Judy and
I'm not there
Sharon.
yet.
That's
I'm not
okay.
there yet
It's hard. It's hard to find them. In fact, 14:36 I think was the hardest one to find this morning.
Of course, you said you were going to do that to me.
I did say I was going to pick on you. Yes, so it
You're
started.
welcome.
It's already started.
Okay,
All right.
I found it.
Now, what these scriptures show is how how Mark wanted to communicate sometimes the exact word that I would say Peter said that Jesus said. That exact word that Jesus said, because it was a significant word. And so you see this in the book of Mark. All right, so I think you're almost there.
I am.
Yeah, it's at the very end. Okay, so what is yours?
Mark 7:11. But you say that if a man says to his father or mother, whatever help you might otherwise have received from me is Corban. That is a gift devoted to God.
So Corban was the word that Jesus used. Look at verse 34, Sharon.
Mark 7:34.
Verse 34. And so he used the word, the exact word that Jesus used, and then he gave the definition. It's hard to find them.
Okay, Mark 7:34. 31. But it just skips to Mark 8.
I know it does look like you'll find it on there. I'm going to give you a second. I'm going to let Judy go on and
Go
share.
ahead.
Okay?
Mark 14:36. Abba, Father, he said, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will.
And so Jesus used the word Abba. He used the Aramaic word Abba. All right? And again, I'm sure, that was important to Peter. That was important to Peter. 15:34.
And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Yes. And what powerful words. Sharon?
Okay, he looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, Ephphatha, which means be opened.
Okay. All right. So again, the Aramaic word that Jesus used is quoted in Mark, which is not typical in the other Gospels. All right. Now, that's Mark. All right. So what I want you to do is I want you to tell me some significant things that you learned about Mark. Just blow them out.
Was the son of a rich woman
Okay.
that was having believers meet.
And her name was Mary.
And that is very significant. I think, okay, so much of Mark is recorded Peter's teachings. All right, very significant, because as you now read Mark, you're going to have that that lens to look at the things that he says. And you're going to go, Peter was there. Peter saw this, and Peter told Mark, and Mark's writing what Peter actually saw. All right, anything else that you want to bullet on here?
I like the last thing that he recorded the Aramaic words
Yes.
that Jesus actually spoke.
What kind of picture did he paint of Jesus?
A human.
A very human.
Very human.
Right.
Human picture. And that's significant as you're looking. You really get that sense of who he was, who Jesus was as a man, you know, as a man, very, very human.
Paul and Barnabas.
Yes.
I don't know how you want to.
Well, you know,
make that shorter.
Yeah, I mean, relationship, okay, between all of them,
Right.
Paul, Barnabas, and Mark.
I think when you look at these things and you think about the relationships, it makes them more human
Yes.
rather than just recording
I
history.
agree. Yes, I think it's so important for us to get a handle on that,
Yeah.
on the realities of what's going on at this time, and who these people were, and why are these things recorded the way they're recorded, instead of just
And to
you know.
remember that they were real, that
Yeah.
they were flesh and blood, they
Yes.
were walking
Yes.
around.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, I'm going to move us on just because we got 3. Okay, we just have one sheet with Matthew, but you are going to be so excited when you begin to get the picture of who Matthew was, why Matthew wrote, and from now on you will never read Matthew exactly the same again. Now, the writings of both Matthew and Luke appear to be efforts to embellish, improve, give more than Mark has given. Additional nuances written for specific audiences with specific purposes. Now, they both seek to show Jesus, though, as less human than Mark did. For example, Mark says things like, he could do no, whereas Matthew says he did not do. Not that absolute totality. They both also strive to show the disciple in a more favorable light. You're going to like this story. Mark says that the disciples, John and who was it? Anyway, they went to ask Jesus who was going to get to sit at his right hand.
Right.
The
Andrew.
disciples went. Who was it?
Andrew.
Thank you.
John's brother. But actually, I thought it was their mother.
Well,
that
okay, listen. Mark says they went.
went.
Matthew says their mother went.
Oh.
Ah.
Okay, what's going on there? We don't know who's right, but we know Matthew did not want to show the disciples as going to see who, you know. So who they're going to blame it on? Who always gets blamed? The mom. Okay, so the mother got blamed. Most of the 582 verses from Mark that Matthew uses, they deal with the life of Jesus, his life. The 200 verses that Matthew and Luke share from Mark describe more about what Jesus said, where Mark tends to speak more about what Jesus did. Okay? So the Matthew and Luke are much more concerned about what he said, his words. Now, I want to tell you one thing that is just kind of an aside, but I want you to be familiar with it. If you would do research on this topic that I'm presenting to you tonight, you'd see at some point referenced a manuscript, and it's called Q, just Q by itself, the letter Q. Q is said to be the common source for all the gospel writings. Now, there is no such document found, but there are references throughout the gospel, and Susie brought in a good one about the Magi and how they had read about the coming of the Christ, and they knew where the star was going to be, and all of that. So, perhaps it's not in the scriptures. So if I just want you to be aware that if you ever do any research, you're going to find references to the Q, but there is no manuscript as such. But most of the authorities say there was indeed a common resource that gospel writers would refer to. Okay. So the authorship of Matthew. Here's what you're going to love not hearing. Okay, or you're going to not love hearing, I guess I should say. The scholars agree that Matthew was not the writer of this gospel. He was the informational source of this gospel, but Matthew, and here's the clincher, Matthew would have written in Hebrew. The manuscript is written in Greek.
Isn't that interesting?
Yep. Matthew was a Jew. He was a Jew, a committed, die-hard Jew. He would have written in Hebrew. This is written in Greek. The whole book is written in Greek. Who was the audience? What's the purpose of Matthew? Matthew is written for Jewish people.
Yes.
Matthew was a Jew. He was a Jew through and through. And it was his purpose to convince the Jews of his time that Jesus was indeed who he said he was, the Son of God, the King, the Messiah. He uses the quotation 16 times. This is to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophets. 16 times he says that. He was all about looking back at the Old Testament and having referenced how Jesus was that fulfillment. Matthew's so very concerned about the Jewish law, and he wants so much for people to respect the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the chief priests. These were his, they were his authority in life. But he is so torn apart because they are totally denying everything that he's come to believe, that Jesus is God's son, that Jesus is the king. And so he is the one, when you read Matthew's writing, he is the one that calls the Pharisees and the chief priest, he calls them every name in the book because he is so angry with them. How can you guys not see this? You've seen the miracles he's done. Look at the Old Testament. Look at everything he says. Can you not see? This is the fulfillment in Jesus. And they refuse to see it. And he lived with this dichotomy of wanting people to respect, and yet he couldn't even respect any longer. So all through his gospel, you're going to see this torn person of the Jewish law, and this is it, and yet you're blind. In fact, he is the one that writes the 7 woes of the Pharisees, the 7 woes. Now, Matthew is the only synoptic gospel, it's a gobble, that uses the word church. And that's in 13, 23, and 18:7. 16, 13 to 23, and 17. He's the only one that makes reference to the church. Matthew is very concerned with the second coming and the judgment that's to follow. It makes sense. He wants his Jewish fellows to know, listen, here he is, and there's going to be a judgment. You've got to be ready for it. You've got to accept him. One of the most significant things about Matthew and the way Matthew's written, it's called the teaching gospel. Matthew was a teacher. He tried to put things down in a way that things could be easily remembered. Remember that they were not reading the Gospels. They were telling them orally. So there's all sorts of things put in groups of threes, groups of seven. And I think I listed some of those for you there somewhere. Anyway, there were three questions there were three times that the angel spoke to Joseph. Is it in there somewhere? Do
Right,
you see
it's a paragraph. There were three messages to
Yes.
Joseph, three denials of Peter,
Yes.
three questions of Pilate, seven parables of the kingdom, seven woes of scribes and Pharisees.
Yes. And so he tried to write things in a way that they could be remembered. He also told teaching stories. He tells the Sermon on the Mount. He talks about the duties of the leaders of the kingdom. He used parables of the kingdom. He talks about the coming of the king. You're going to see as you read Matthew now from this lens how he was so writing to the Jewish people, but how he was trying to write in a way that people could actually remember what he was saying. Now, his dominating idea was that Jesus was the king. And that term is used by Matthew more than any of the other gospel writers. Okay, so from now on, when you look at Matthew, you have a lens to look through. It's not just that he was writing to you and me. He was writing to a specific audience for a specific purpose. All right, so what is that? What is it?
And he was telling them, he wanted them to know that Jesus was who he said he was.
Yes, to believe in Jesus as the fulfillment. Yes. And then what was the last thing I said that was kind of significant? How was it written? Pardon? It's teaching, yes. It was a teaching. It was written to be taught.
So as you're saying that he did not write it, who wrote it?
All right. We do not know. There's no anywhere even speculation on who wrote Matthew. But again, it didn't matter at that time. It was who was honored for the information. Very new concept to me. Yeah, and it was one I had to really check. I mean, that was one I kept going back and really making sure that I had that right.
But we still think of him as the writer because he had the information.
That's exactly right. And there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. It's just that we know he did not pin it. He did not pin it. All right. So we have Mark that is showing Jesus as a man. All right. And he was giving all of this basic information. And we see Jesus through the lens of Peter and his teaching. Now we see Matthew, who wants us to look back at the Old Testament, wants us to know, wants the Jewish people to know, this is the Messiah. This is the Son of God. Get your act together and believe in him.